Welcome to Talking Shop with Covering Climate Now. I'm Mark Herstgaard, the Executive Director of Covering Climate Now and the Environment Correspondent at The Nation magazine. Thank you all for being here. We are so happy to have so many of our fellow journalists here today for this Talking Shop discussing covering climate change and racial justice. Before we begin, I'd like everyone to take a moment in silence to remember there are many of us, especially our Black colleagues, who are hurting right now, in pain, angry. Let's be respectful of that. Let's be respectful of one another and caring of one another as we proceed today. Let's also remember that large numbers of people of all backgrounds are now rising up to say no more. In the words of the old spiritual, a change is going to come. And it's past time for America's newsrooms to change, and not just in how they cover the climate story. For those of you who don't know, Covering Climate Now is a global collaboration of more than 400 news outlets with a combined audience approaching 2 billion people. All of us committed to better coverage of the defining story of our time. All bona fide newsrooms are invited to join us. There is no cost or editorial line except for respecting climate science. Visit our website, coveringclimatenow.org. Check out the resources we've posted, including our climate justice reporting guide. Sign up for our weekly newsletter, The Climate Beat, and make a note, our next Talking Shop will be on July 1st, co-hosted with our colleagues at Climate Central and focusing on the climate connections to extreme weather. There's going to be a lot of that extreme weather this summer, so you don't want to miss that. I am very grateful to our 3 superb panelists today. I'll introduce them all at once. Each will give a very brief presentation, and then I will moderate the Q&A. We've received a lot of questions already. There's a lot of people on this call. We will get to as many questions as we can. Please use the chat box to submit more during the presentations. And you're also invited to tweet about this using the hashtag CCNow. Okay, now it's my great pleasure to introduce first Varshini Prakash, the co-founder and executive director of the Sunrise Movement, which has done more than any other group to push the idea of a Green New Deal onto the public agenda, an intersectional Green New Deal. And Yessenia Funes, a senior staff writer for Earther, Gizmodo, and Kendra Pierre-Louis, a veteran climate reporter, recently with the New York Times. This, my colleagues, is going to be a terrific conversation. Thank you so much for being here. And now, Varshini, please get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Mark, and the whole team at Covering Climate Now. And I'm so thrilled to be on this panel with Yessenia and Kendra. Hello, my name is Varshini. I am happy to be here. And for those of you who don't know what Sunrise Movement is, we are organizing thousands of young people to channel their anger and frustration and hope about the climate crisis into political action at all levels of government. And I guess I'll start a little bit with a bit on my personal story. My family is from southern India, and I think some of my earliest transformative moments were watching the ways that storms and floods and tsunamis were decimating communities that looked and felt like home. I heard stories about places near my family's village in India where Coca-Cola used up all the drinking water for their factories that existed in the area, and were selling farmers fertilizer that was actually chemical sludge. And I didn't enter the world as a climate activist or an environmentalist. I just knew that when I was a teenager, people around the world, many of whom who looked like me, didn't have water, didn't have enough food, didn't have access to a house or basic sanitation, couldn't choose to leave when hurricanes struck or seas flooded their homes. I didn't know this was environmental injustice or climate injustice. I just knew that there was a world where people could not meet their most basic necessities at a time when we are experiencing the greatest wealth this world has ever seen, and that was impermissible to me. And so to me, the fight for environmental justice is the fight for equality, for justice, for fairness, for protection, like any other fight for justice. It is a question of who are the winners and the losers in a society, who matters and who doesn't, who is considered disposable or can be sacrificed and who cannot, and that story cuts across virtually every facet of the human condition, whatever you can possibly think of, from the incarceration system to healthcare to jobs in the economy and the environment, which I think is a bit of a misnomer, because what we are discussing here is what people need to meet their requirements for survival, and it is everything that sustains and drives life on this planet, right? Air, water, land, energy, shelter, community. It is virtually everything that we come across and that we touch, and we cannot exist without it. So specifically about environmental injustice, I mean, Heather McGhee defines racism as the notion that there is a hierarchy of human value, not a notion, as you know, the fact that there's a hierarchy of human value in this country that is based on the idea that white skin is better than others and what we should all aspire to. And it's an idea that didn't really take root in the United States and elsewhere until the 17th century. It is a structure that is, and a system that is less than 400 years old, and yet something that we take for fact, and a viral sickness that has spread to virtually every part of our lives, whether we are conscious of it or not. And so collectively, environmental injustice is the treatment of people disproportionately based on this hierarchy of human value, based on the color of people's skin, the amount of money that they might have in their pocket, their gender identity, their status, their citizenship status, and where they live. And so I can't see anybody's face right now, but if you are so willing, I would love for everyone to just take a second and just take one very deep, very long breath. And to me, environmental justice is achieved when every person alive on this planet can take that breath and have it be the same breath, to have it be clean and fresh and life-giving. And so I think ultimately environmental and climate justice forces us to ask, for the sake of what and why do we care about the rising carbon in our atmosphere? Why do we care about parts per million or degrees of warming or any of that? Because the consequences are human. And this is actually good news, because it allows us to connect this issue to what matters to people, not just what might matter to scientists and economists, who are very important, but haven't always connected this to people's lived conditions. So I'm glad we're talking about this here, because environmental justice is so often something that has been marginalized and specialized in our media environment, when I believe it's related to virtually everything that is happening in our country right now. So a couple examples: if you take the coronavirus crisis, we understand the ways that our system has created unequal environments, creating food deserts in poor communities and Black and Brown communities, so people only have access to unhealthy foods. And we see those communities suffering from heart disease and other health issues that make them more vulnerable to the complications with COVID. Or we see that the most polluting industries are located in poor, usually Black, Indigenous, or Latinx neighborhoods. So you have people suffering from asthma or cancer that are experiencing the complications from COVID. We're seeing young people in precarious jobs with limited benefits and protections. So they're the first to be unemployed in overwhelming numbers in moments of recession. If we look at the uprising happening in our country right now, all of the agitation and everything that is happening is fundamentally asking the question, what are our priorities as a nation? What do we care about? What is the role of government at this time? Is it to punish people, to deliver so-called justice through pain, to dehumanize people in an incarceral system, particularly for Black and Brown people, and fund that incarceral system so disproportionately? Or is it to invest in what allows communities to thrive? And the Green New Deal and the issue of the climate crisis asks so many of the same questions. Do we invest in pollution, in driving climate chaos, or will we invest in a healthier, more sustainable planet and world that works for all of us? And so I think there's no way for these issues to be unlinked. And as we continue to talk, I think we can get into specific examples of this. But for Sunrise specifically, we have realized that there is no other way to tackle the climate crisis. We have been watching the way in which organizations that came before us were not actually able to build a big enough tent because they focused so narrowly on the issues that they left too many people out. They focused so much on carbon and inanimate things that they couldn't speak to people's lived experiences and make the issue matter in terms that people could understand and act upon. And we have tried for 40 years to try to solve the climate crisis without addressing racism and economic inequality at the same time. It has not worked. And so in the organization, at its inception, when we launched in 2017, we made a strong commitment to address these crises at the same time, because without it, we will simply just exacerbate an existing unfair system, as well as leave behind the same people who have been fighting for the ability to be seen, heard, valued, and have the same rights as others since the dawn of America. So I'll leave it there, and excited to get into the discussion.
Thank you so much, Varshini. And I neglected earlier, pardon me, I'll just say this quickly before introducing Kendra. I should let everyone know we are recording this session today. We will be posting it later online, so just bear that in mind as you make your comments. And now we'll hear from Kendra Pierre-Louis. She is a longtime climate reporter, most recently with the New York Times. Kendra?
Thanks, Mark. And thanks everyone for having me here today. And thanks, Varshini, for her great speech. And I'm going to warn you guys ahead of time that mine will not be anywhere near as polished. So I've mostly been thinking a lot about what from a slightly different lens than Varshini, which is a journalistic lens of like, what does it mean to report on eco-justice? And one of the things I think is that eco-justice is, as Varshini hinted, or stated pretty eloquently, part of the climate story. And so if you're not getting into the context of who is being affected by things, by aspects of climate change that you're reporting on in every story, then you're not telling the real climate story. It's almost like the opposite. It's journalistic negligence, because you're only speaking, you're speaking in highly technical, the whole reason you're reporting on it as a journalist is because it has implications to society and to humans, and you're leaving that part of the story out. And it's something that I think I've tried to do for a really long time, and I try to do in a lot of my stories, even as someone who wrote primarily from a scientific perspective. But I also think it's something that I don't think editors have fully understood. I don't think it's something that news institutions have really understood. Oftentimes, eco-justice, when it's reported on at all, gets siloed into a very narrow eco-justice frame. And so what I really, and so it's like this bucket that like, oh, we've done this, we've done the eco-justice story this year, we can move on, sorry. And what I hope comes out of this conversation today, and what I hope people take away from what this discussion today, is this idea that this is something that needs to be embedded in all aspects of their climate reporting, and that climate needs to be embedded in all aspects of other reporting. So if you're an energy reporter and you're reporting on Exxon and you're reporting on quarterly findings and you're not mentioning climate change in that report, that's also gross negligence. Like, climate change touches every aspect. It's not just something that needs to hang out in this very specific climate silo. And on that note, I'm done, but also I will be right back. I have an alarm going off. Sorry.
Well, and that's how you know this is live, folks. We are live here. This is a talking shop with Covering Climate Now. I'm Mark Herstgaard, and Kendra has now rejoined us. Kendra, were you actually finished, or would you like to say?
I was actually done, but I also needed to turn off my alarm because it would keep going.
All right, we'll turn now to Yessenia Funes in just a moment. I'll just remind everybody, there is the chat box. Please send your questions in. We do have a lot of them already queued up, but we're eager for more. So as people say things that resonate with you, or you know, rub you the wrong way, let's get into it. Let's have the conversation. Talking shops are collegial conversation among journalists. There are no flacks here. There's no government officials. So with no further ado, we turn now to Yessenia Funes, who has done some terrific reporting. And I'm just going to embarrass her really quickly here and say one more time how much I loved her recent story. If you didn't see it, you've got to read her story on birding while black. Yessenia, take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mark, for the great introduction. And again, for mentioning that piece. I always appreciate it. My name is Yessenia Funes. I'm a senior staff writer at Earther. We're the environmental vertical at Gizmodo. I guess I just want to give you all a brief piece of background. I actually got interested in reporting on climate issues because of my interest in justice issues. I didn't come into this with the sort of scientific interest that I think a lot of climate reporters come into this topic, similar to Varshini, but grew my interest in climate change and the climate crisis at large was the disproportionate impact that this would have on communities of color, was the disproportionate impact that the industries that fuel climate change, the oil and gas industry, the disproportionate impact that those industries have on Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities, Latinx communities. And so for me, when I approach this topic, I often, and I want to be clear, I report on climate science and things unrelated to justice as well, but my passion and my expertise certainly does lie within, the sort of EJ umbrella, as folks, refer to it as. So when I'm looking at, the news every day, I often look at what is, I guess, the racial justice news of the day. When COVID began to spread among communities and it became clear that this was a health issue that would impact respiratory systems, when the impacts on Black communities became really clear, I asked myself, this has to be an environmental story. The connections there weren't quite clear to me immediately, but as reporters, we don't often have the answers, but we have the questions, right? And so often my approach is to find the experts who may be able to give me some clarity on this and break down whether there is a connection. And, I got to tell you, there always is a connection. As Kendra mentioned, climate influences every part of our life. And when it comes to racial inequities, that's no exception. And I think it's important to note that we as reporters, as environmental reporters, climate reporters at large, it's important that we think more broadly of what the environment is, right? I think that there's this idea that environmental issues, environmental stories are about our oceans or our public lands or national parks. But environmental stories are those that impact people just spending time in their backyards. The environment is my community here in Queens, New York. All of this is the environment. And it's important for people to think, to sort of reframe how we think of the environment and recognize that the environment is where people work, where people play, where people live. And that's, a key phrase used among the EJ movement to get folks thinking more critically about the environment, and especially for reporters, more critically about the kinds of stories that you cover and what is included under the environmental journalism umbrella. And just briefly, this Black birder story that Mark has mentioned, I've been lucky enough to work with news orgs that center environmental justice and justice-focused environmental journalism. And that story actually was something that my editor, who is a white dude, Brian Kahn, you all might be familiar with his work, he's incredible. He was like, hey, this is happening. I know these organizers, like, you should totally do this, because he knows that it's very much in the realm of my interests. And I feel really lucky and privileged to have that sort of support from my editors, and it's something that I've experienced in all the newsrooms I've worked in. So we set up a call, and it was that easy, asking the right questions, having support of my editors, and just writing a story the way that anyone would write any other type of story. I think it's really unfortunate that some newsrooms create obstacles for environmental reporters to pursue these types of stories. And I think that often is a result of reporters, or editors rather, who don't have a clear understanding of the climate crisis, the urgency, the gravity of the climate crisis, and more importantly, the inequity that's baked into the climate crisis. Because if editors lack that understanding, they're not going to realize the value of telling those stories. And I think that's an unfortunate reality in many newsrooms, that comes down to lack of diversity in newsrooms, but also just a sort of narrow view on what is the climate crisis, what is the environment, and what falls under the environmental journalism umbrella. So I'll end at that, and we're looking forward to hearing everyone's questions and the discussion we'll have here.
Thank you so much, Yessenia. That's Yessenia Funes of Earther at the Vertical at Gizmodo. There are a number of questions, and I am going to leave the names of the questioners off for confidentiality reasons, and also just to encourage the frankest and most candid conversation here among us as working journalists. So I'll just say that this particular question comes from a journalist at one of the major TV networks. And it's kind of a two-part question. The first part I'd like to direct to Varshini, and the second part to Yessenia and Kendra. So the first is to Varshini. What are the main untold EJ stories right now in the climate sphere? What are two or three that just cry out to you as, wow, why is nobody telling that story? And then second, to Yessenia and to Kendra, what do you do to pitch editors? And maybe this is really your question, Kendra, given what Yessenia just said. What do you do to basically convince an editor who is lagging on this, who is resistant to this, who wants that, as you said, wants that climate justice story? We do it once a year and just like Christmas, and then it's gone. So Varshini, can you start? And then we'll go to Kendra, and then Yessenia, if you want to add something, please do.
Yes, my God, it feels hard to pick just one or two, but I'm sure, I mean, there's a story in virtually every neighborhood that feels on par with Flint, Michigan, or anything, you know, any of those places. One of the ones I've been working really closely as part of this Joe Biden joint task force on climate with a brilliant woman named Katherine Flowers. And she lives in Lowndes County in Alabama and talks a lot about the impacts on particularly Black communities in Alabama who don't have infrastructure around wastewater. And so you're having communities that are literally having whatever was in their toilet end up in their front yards and are fighting for like basic infrastructure that white communities down the street, you know, take for granted. And so I think that is a really powerful, really important story. And I'm happy to share some resources and also just direct you directly to her and people like her. She's really fantastic. As well as I think there are a lot of stories happening right now. Obviously people know about Hurricane Katrina and a lot of the effects in Louisiana and New Orleans following that, but I think there's a lot to follow up on, particularly around the story of Cancer Alley. Like Cancer Alley in Louisiana is set on former slave plantations. The relationship between Black communities as well as, you know, indigenous communities that live in New Orleans and are about to have already been displaced because of sea level rise is, I think, extremely important. And just the impact that has had on communities and the role of the fossil fuel industry, as well as, you know, chemical plants and in that area, I think is well worth digging into beyond even some of the climate impacts part of that story. So I'm happy to also, if it's helpful, I can send a list of like, I have like 20 of these that we could point to, and I'd be happy to share them after the call and point you to who you can talk to.
Varshini, that'd be great. And we will post that at Covering Climate Now at our website on the resources page. Kendra.
One of the things that I think because of the origins of sort of environmental movement in the United States and the political polarization of, I swear I'm getting to a point, of the environmental movement, climate change has sort of fallen into this bucket where it can, especially if you're talking about people sort of over the age of 35, where a lot of editors kind of worry that it's an activist issue. And so they also often see racial justice as an activist issue. So you're essentially, in their minds, taking two activist issues that are difficult to cover objectively and lumping them together. And I think that's where some of the resistance comes from. For me, and this is probably just a facet of my training as a science journalist, which is generally when I have a question or an idea, the first thing I do is turn to Google Scholar and see if there's data on it. And then if there's data on it, then I try and find someone to tell that story, like not like a source, but like the human context for which to bring that story alive. And that's one way you can get over it. I also, as I said, sort of at the top, don't treat climate justice or eco-justice as a one story a year issue. So I slip it in a lot of times into other stories. So if I'm working on a story on coral reefs, for example, actually this did happen like last year. There was a story, it was a like 400 word story on coral bleaching in Hawaii. And I found someone who lives in a traditional Hawaiian village whose livelihood would actually be impacted by the fact that this coral reef was bleaching. And so like anchoring those stories, which are quote unquote science stories, in the stories of communities, in the stories of people who are actually suffering the repercussions, is one way you kind of get around that block, because they're not then seeing it as an eco-justice story. The other is you just pitch a lot and you make a lot of noise and you make it sort of difficult for them to say no to all of your ideas. Eventually one or two will make it through. It sucks, but that's kind of the reality of the situation, is if you pitch enough, you'll eventually be allowed to do some of them, if only to shut you up.
Yessenia, did you want to add anything at the moment?
No, I think that last point Kendra made around just being really persistent and emphasizing to your, team and your bosses that this is something you want to devote more time and attention to, might surprise you that they might give in eventually.
We've gotten a number of questions from some of our international colleagues, and I want to remind everyone, although Covering Climate Now is based here in the United States, we are a global collaboration. In fact, the reason that we have 2 billion audience combined has to do with our overseas partners as well. So let's talk a little bit about that. In particular, this concept of that is very tied to climate justice, of loss and damage. This is something, for those of you who don't know, in the long UN climate negotiations, that the most affected countries, the poorest countries of the world, have pushed this notion of loss and damage, just like they were the ones at Paris who pushed the 1.5 degree target. And loss and damage is basically, in shorthand, the idea that the people who committed this crime are the ones who should pay when Bangladesh gets flooded, who should pay for the resilience measures that are needed in African agriculture, shall we say. So could one of you as a panelist talk about that, how we as journalists can get our arms around that? Because I've listened to activists talking about that for a long time, especially activists from outside of the US, but it doesn't make a big appearance in US media coverage. Either Yessenia or Kendra, do you want to?
I had actually been working on a story that sort of, I don't want to give away details because I'm really hoping I can still do it after COVID, but it sort of looked at that and it anchored loss and damage, and it contrasted it to another bucket of money that the US was spending on a different issue. But had we spent money on like adaptation and mitigation, we wouldn't be spending money in this other, lots and lots of money in this other bucket. And then COVID happened and I couldn't go to the part of the world where this was supposed to take place. And so I've had to, unfortunately, to put that story on hold, but I do think it is possible to do it in that capacity, right? So like, it's kind of what, like taking it outside of this particular story and sort of taking it into like looking at what's happening with like prison reform right now. A lot of the way that people are pushing through like policing reform and prison reform is saying, we're spending all of this money in this bucket and it's not working. And we could spend a fraction of this money in this other bucket and it will work and it will be more effective. And so I think that is one way you can kind of get at that story, because the United States spends a tremendous amount of money in war. We spend a tremendous amount of money in like aid that we could be spending on climate adaptation and climate mitigation, so that some of these conflicts don't break out, so that some of these countries don't need aid from disaster. And so that's some other way of getting at that story, I think. I think I'm repeating myself now.
Varshini, could you speak a little bit to Sunrise's role here in terms of your solidarity and activism with others? And also, I'm mindful of the fact that you are now serving on the climate task force that Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders put together to try and fashion a common Democratic Party position on climate change going into the November elections. Have you dealt with this concept of loss and damage as part of a climate policy for the Democratic Party and perhaps the next president?
Yeah, I mean, so I can share a little bit. So one of the co-founders of Sunrise, actually several of the co-founders of Sunrise were activated and moved to build an organization like Sunrise because they had been so involved from a civilian standpoint in the UN negotiations, and had attended all of these conferences and things like that, and really seen firsthand the role that the United States plays and has played historically in being a heavy polluter and also a heavy obstructionist at the international level, and the leadership that many island nations and low-lying nations have been playing in saying, this isn't a matter of politics, this is literally our lives. We're drowning right now. You can see it happening on a day-to-day basis. And so for Sunrise, what we realized was the best way to be in solidarity sort of internationally was to come correct at home and to move our entire government to be in alignment with what the science has said, absolutely unequivocally, no ambiguity about the urgency of action on this issue. So I guess that's to say we don't have a huge international presence, but we do have connections with a lot of movements, particularly because of the global youth strike movement. I have to say, I sort of regret that a lot of those relationships are largely in the global north. They're all wonderful people. I just mean, like, I would like to have more relationships in the global south, and that has not really come about yet. But I think this question of just, we cannot sort of lose sight of the fact that this carbon knows no borders, and the crises that we face know no borders, and it doesn't matter whether we put borders up or not. We are dealing with, we're going to be dealing with like millions upon millions of climate refugees if we don't deal with the situation soon. We're going to be dealing with stuff that is far worse than what we saw with the Syrian refugee crisis or what was happening earlier last year. And we've got to have a plan for it, and we've got to stop it before it happens. And so I think for me, this is something that we've got to take up as the Democratic Party, or just in our politics. I can't share the inner stuff with this task force, but it is, we are definitely thinking about the international ramifications here, and the US's responsibility and all of that.
Thank you very much. Yessenia, here's a question, and you can see it all in the chat box there. And I guess I'd like all of you to comment on this, but especially to journalists. We touched on this briefly before, but the line between activism and journalism, and how do we as journalists not only respect that line, but help the people that we work with, our sources, whether they be activists or government officials or what have you, recognize that there is a difference between journalists and activists. So Yessenia, could you start with that, and then maybe Kendra after that?
Yeah, I think that this is a great question, and it comes up in all of the conversations I have around reporting on this intersection between race and the environment. And I think ultimately it's important for us to think back to what is our role as journalists, right? Our role is to speak truth to power, to tell stories that center the lives of human beings, right? I would argue that journalism itself is a form of advocacy because of the truth-telling part of the job. I'm not a fan of this term advocacy journalism. I don't think that it's necessarily, a journalist's job to go about, saying what is right and wrong, but I do think it is our job to speak to those and to feature the voices of those who are advocating. When it comes to environmental justice, many of the experts on this topic are advocates. Many of the experts on this topic are just people living their lives and suffering at the hands of industrial pollution. I always try to include a number of sources in my pieces, and include voices of academics, voices of scientists, because much of what we know around environmental justice is supported by data. It is supported by peer-reviewed literature. But I think it's important to recognize, and ask yourself, what do you think is your job as a journalist? And I'm sorry, there's a car outside blasting music, so you guys might hear that. But ultimately, journalism is itself, I would argue, a form of advocacy. And I think that people should feel comfortable with that if they came into this job to tell stories that are true, fair, and shed light on the injustices that exist within our society. You know, that's why I became a journalist. But of course, there is a fine line there, I think. And whether you're, you know, if you're a columnist, that line is a lot more blurred. And we at Gizmodo are given a lot more liberties, and I think a lot of the legacy publications are not. You know, we have a lot more freedom to give voice and to offer our opinions in pieces and to include ourselves and insert ourselves and our lived experiences in our pieces. That's encouraged at Gizmodo. I know that's not the case at very many other sites though, so I'd love to hear what Kendra has to say about this.
Go ahead, Kendra.
Sorry, I was muted. So for me, generally, where I was fortunate, I think, to start my journalism career in the newsroom inside Climate News, which, you know, they were like, there is no debate, climate change is real. we're not going to report on both sides, and we're operating from the perspective that the climate is changing. And then I often joke that, you know, I am biased because I have an earth-friendly bias. I'm really into the idea that we don't all die from climate change. So, I mean, I think what gets lost oftentimes is that there are inherent biases that that are all over the newspapers that we report on. When you read a newspaper from 100 years ago, you're sometimes horrified at the things that they wrote, because the things that they wrote were reflecting the cultural biases, the cultural norms of the time, right? And so for me, it's where I tend to draw the line is I recognize that some of the things that I write probably have some weird embedded bias that I just can't see because I'm living through it. But where I personally draw the line is I don't advocate for any solutions. I will say that we need to act on climate change, but where I think it's really, really important is that I not say that like this energy source or that energy source is the solution. What my role as a journalist in that capacity, like if we're talking about like in that bucket, is to be someone who can actually be, I don't actually believe in neutrality, but like a balanced arbiter of what we understand about the possible solutions towards climate change. So even if I don't, so I think that's where I sort of draw the line, is saying that we do need to solve climate change. I don't think is a biased perspective unless you're like a nihilist. But saying that like the solution is in like ocean wind turbines and that's the only thing that will solve it and we all need to go on a seaweed diet, I think is like taking it too far. Like that is not my role as a journalist. But saying that like seaweed, like showing the data on seaweed and showing that seaweed farmers are existing or something, that is a fair role, I think.
Thank you, Kendra. I'll just offer one more thought on this as far as the line between activism and journalism. And this comes from my long experience at The Nation magazine, where we have consistently reported on social movements. And part of the reason that we always say that we are journalists, not activists, is that we have to hold social movements to account as well. Not just governments, not just corporations, but social movements. So over 10 years ago, for example, I wrote a cover story in The Nation magazine taking the mainstream US environmental organizations to task for their lack of racial and economic diversity and for their lack of attention to these issues. So there is an important role, I think, for us as journalists to say, no, we're not activists, because as soon as we blur that line, we can no longer report on them. Now, the larger problem is that the mainstream media, for the most part, does not report on these social movements. So for my money, that is one of the most important things that could come out of this conversation, is for news organizations to realize that these social movements are newsmakers. We automatically think that government officials are newsmakers. We often think that corporations are newsmakers. So are the people who are changing things in the streets. Let me now move to another question. And this may put my journalistic colleagues a little on the spot, but it's come up here. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Part of the problem is that newsrooms in the United States in particular, but also overseas, are still not very diverse. It's gotten better recently at the reporting level, but still at the editorial and the news executive level, the gatekeepers, as it were, it's still mainly people who look like me, you know, middle-aged white guys. So what has your experience been there? Is that, how do we deal with that issue? And, you know, I took your point before, Kendra, if you just keep, you know, nattering at them, they'll eventually, wear you down. I mean, you'll eventually wear them down, but surely we have to do better than that.
I think it's pretty simple. I just hire more people of color. I don't understand why that's such a difficult thing for news organizations to do. You know, one thing that I've been pushing for within my own organization, I'm also the diversity committee chair for our union. I've been trying to push for our management to give us anti-racist and implicit bias training. I don't think that that's something that's quite common or is as common as it should be among news organizations, and it reinforces a lot of the stereotypes and unconscious biases that leaders in these organizations have that may be hindering their ability to hire journalists of color, to create opportunities for their journalists of color, to create a safe environment for their employees of color. And I think that it's important for people at the top, you know, beyond the editor level, you know, I'm talking about like executive editors, CEOs, SVPs at these media companies, you know, the people that I'm trying to have these discussions with, to listen to their employees, even the junior staff people, even junior staff employees, you know, those of us on the lower ring of things, listen to us, especially your employees of color, when we flag the institutional racism that exists at many of these institutions. I mean, Twitter has blown up in the last 2 weeks, highlighting just the lack of, you know, pay equity that exists among legacy publications. It is just egregious to see the way journalists of color have been paid over the years. And I'm sure, you know, I'm sure Kendra and I can speak to our own experiences on that front. But listening, I think, is such an important first step without getting defensive, without getting aggressive. It's such an important first step that often never happens in these newsrooms, because people put up, you know, white colleagues put up those walls and say, hey, I'm not a racist, when that's not what the conversation is about. You know, institutional racism isn't about, you know, pointing fingers and saying, you're a racist, I'm not a racist. You know, it's about addressing the systemic inequities that exist among how much people are getting paid, who has the resources to move up in this company, who's getting to cover what stories, you know, who's covering like political stories, which are often among, you know, the most elite beats in these news organizations. Having those hard conversations and just listening to those of us who have lived these experiences is such an important thing that just does not happen in a constructive way, unfortunately. And until those conversations can happen, you know, organizations are going to struggle to hire more diverse staff, and they're going to struggle to retain that diverse staff, because you might, you know, have someone on staff for a year or two, but if they don't feel safe in that news environment, they're going to, you know, run and flee as soon as they can to find a better work environment. Yeah, I'll end there.
I was going to joke that Mark must have been reading my Twitter feed.
I never
I know, I've been pretty public about this. I would actually push back a little bit on your numbers, only because, like, I don't think hiring is enough, because, and Yessenia kind of hinted at this at the end, because the attrition rate for journalists of color is abysmal. We don't stay. We're, after I sort of tweeted what I tweeted recently about sort of how certain work environments aren't great, you know, I spent 3 days fielding private messages from journalists who either are still at my former institution or who left because they couldn't deal, you know. And I was talking to a friend today who works in a different industry. She's not in journalism, and she was saying that her job is doing this thing, which is sort of like making people aware of the fact that the workplace norms are like a white workplace norms, and they're the default, and we're all sort of bathing in it. And that oftentimes what people of color are coming up against when they go to work are these norms that have been set by white people. And in journalism in particular, I think it becomes extremely personal, because you as a reporter or you as an editor, you go to your editor and you say, I want to do this story. And they're saying that this thing, oftentimes, potentially even of communities that look like you, don't have value. So if that's what they're saying about this story, what are they saying about you? Somebody tweeted, Tinzina Vega at WNYC tweeted today about her editor who told her that Black Lives Matter movement wasn't going to do anything. that same publication published a story the other day that Black Lives Matter is the most effective social movement in American history. There's a 4-year gap between those two things, right? But like, that tells you the perspective that they're coming from, and it's a perspective of a woman who wasn't listened to, and that you can only go so long without being listened to. And it, as Yessenia hinted at, it does involve trust, but at some point, you know, one person told me they left the industry completely and decided to go into a medical care field. They're not even in journalism anymore because they're like, there's just so many, you can only go from one abusive newsroom to another abusive newsroom before you're like, peace, I'm out. Like, this isn't an industry that wants people like me. And so you can keep funneling people out of journalism programs. You can keep funneling people out of college programs. But they're never going to progress because they're going to get burnt out, even if before they ever, even putting aside any other barriers you put in place, they're going to get burnt down and they're going to quit before they have the opportunity to reach that next stage in their career to facilitate down. And oftentimes the people who get promoted may look like me, but they are people who've become acculturated to white culture. So they still replicate the norm. And I don't know how you change that, but it needs to change. And based on what's been going on in media for the past 2 weeks, something is shifting. I think the combination of COVID, I think the combination of that op-ed, I think the combination of George Floyd has crystallized things for a lot of people in a way that I don't think has been crystallized before.
Kendra, I want to be careful how I ask this question because I want to be respectful of your own situation, but you said something to me the other day about this, about the kind of mindset that exists in some of the newsrooms that you've worked in, where there is the thought now on the part of some managers that they know they need to do more on diversity, but the follow through is not always what it should be.
Right, it's the idea that you go and you hire a person of color, you go and you get a Black person or a brown person or an Asian person, and then they fit that diversity quota, and then they don't listen to them.
Right. You said
there's actually a line. Have anyone know The Cutting Edge? And not The Cutting Edge, Center Stage. It's a ballet movie, if you're a woman of a certain age. But somebody in the comments knows it. So there's a line. The big thing that matters is there's a character at the end, and she is choosing between top of the line ballet program or this new ballet company. And she essentially tells the director of the top of the line ballet company that she doesn't want to know if she got in or not, because she says, if I didn't get in, it will devastate me. And if I did get in, I don't know if I'll be able to say no. And if I say no, I will spend the best years of my dancing life waving a ballet in the back of a court, and I'm better than that. And so I think what happens is people know their worth and they leave. They find some place where they can execute their talents.
Yes, and I recall what you said was that you said, you know, you all want to hire somebody who looks like me,
but thinks like you.
Which is about the best single line description of that I've ever heard of. I want to turn now quickly to Varshini and talk about the, you know, your work on the Green New Deal, but beyond that, because of the COVID-19 crisis, governments all over the world now are talking about spending trillions of dollars to revive their stricken economies. Let's try and talk about that story because that's a big upcoming story now, especially here with the Green New Deal talk. And one of the things that's interesting about the Green New Deal, and that has not gotten a lot of attention in the coverage of it here in the States, is that it is intersectional. Your idea of a green stimulus is very different from what the EU is pushing, the IMF. I mean, a lot of global establishment figures are now saying, yes, we need a green stimulus, but they're not talking about the kind of stimulus that you guys are they?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, so for a lot of what we've been discussing is, okay, we have a situation where there are over 40 million people who are unemployed right now. We know for a fact that the economy that we had before COVID hit was extremely unequal, and particularly unequal in a racialized way. We know that, you know, the first people to, some of the people to lose the most jobs in this crisis were young people. And a lot of people are asking in this moment, why would we go back to a system that was broken at its core? And how can we use this moment to not just get back to reestablish whatever the heck people conceive of as normal, but to actually build something better than was before. And so we've been sort of putting our heads together with a lot of different organizations. The most amazing thing about working in the Green New Deal landscape is that it has totally blown up the fight around climate change to include economic justice, racial justice, political organizations that are far beyond just the realm of quote unquote environmentalist organizations. And we have been able to talk about, what would it look like to actually grasp upon this moment to build a form of a jobs and green infrastructure plan that actually targets low-income communities, communities of color, that makes massive investments in communities in public infrastructure, in jobs programs, in energy efficiency programs, in things modeled off of the New Deal, like a civilian climate corps that might employ millions of young people to do the important work of stopping the climate crisis. Why don't we use this moment to actually ensure that people in this country can be guaranteed a job, that we are tackling the climate crisis in this moment, that we are actually building a more resilient, equitable economy out of this crisis than what we had previously. And I think, there are a lot of lessons. Like 10 years ago, a similar thing, but on a slightly smaller scale happened. And the Obama administration invested just like about $90 billion into tackling the climate crisis through a bunch of programs. And that has led to, us finding that solar and wind and fossil fuels are basically at cost parity now. Like, just small investments made such a huge difference. And if we actually targeted government investments towards communities of color and low-income people and around tackling the climate crisis and building a more resilient economy, at the scale of trillions, not billions, we could be well on our way to solving the climate crisis. So that's something that we're working on internally right now. We don't really, obviously we have been full force organizing around this uprising that is happening in our country right now. And so we have had, we're revisiting that conversation in the next few weeks, but I think it is absolutely critical the way we rebuild over the long term, and whether or not in this moment we decide to support the communities that have been the most impacted by COVID, or whether we choose to leave them behind again and exacerbate the level of inequality that exists in this nation. I just want to say, can I say one thing about the journalist thing that I never worked in a newsroom. I can't say I have any expertise on that, but I don't think that any institution or organization is exempt from that question. And so I actually think it's very similar across virtually every institution that exists in this country right now should be asking themselves those questions. And we're asking ourselves those questions in Sunrise too. Like, how do you actually build a more multiracial, multi-class movement in a movement that has been historically dominated by a lot of wealthier white people? And it's really hard, and we're not succeeding all the time. I think that, I think what has moved us along in a big way is people in high levels of leadership having personal reckonings with how far we are from actually building a culture and institution that feels welcoming and inclusive and powerful for anybody to be a part of, and recognizing that what it takes is a level of organizational and institutional transformation that goes far beyond interpersonal relationships. And I don't really know how change happens in newsrooms. I'm really curious about that. Maybe that's a question for offline, but how does that happen? Like, how have transformational things happened in newsrooms previously throughout our history, and how could they happen again? Because I think just trying to fill diversity quotas more, or, making little tweaks around the edges is not going to solve a lot of the systemic problems that we're talking about. And I would be really curious, I think even just a few high-level leaders at a few legacy newsrooms, it would make a dramatic impact if there were like massive commitments made on this, and people recognize the need for that level of transformation. So that would be very exciting, and I think it actually can happen much faster than people think, and also like requires a little bit, just a few leaders really throwing down could make a huge difference in a way that I don't know if people realize.
Thanks, Varshini. As we've seen out in the streets now, change is happening a lot faster than we've ever thought it possible. One of the things we're trying to do with Covering Climate Now is to change the conversation in newsrooms around the country around the climate story, and specifically this part of it, the justice angle of it. We only have about 4 minutes left, so I'm just gonna have one more quick question for the journalists here from one of our colleagues, and then we'll wrap up, which is there a way to a framework for reporters at all these different newsrooms to seek out what are the justice stories that we should be doing, as opposed to just catch as catch can. Obviously, it's always great to talk to a great source who says, oh, here's this idea. But is there any kind of framework? You know, obviously, again, we're trying to do this at Covering Climate Now. Do please look at our reporter's guide on climate justice. But first, Yessenia, and then Kendra.
Yeah, so was the question, I guess, can you just rephrase the question?
Is there a framework, an existing framework where reporters can say, okay, here, I want to do this story. I want to start doing the environmental justice story. How do I start?
Right on. Yeah, I think that you start by getting in touch with the leaders and communities that are doing the environmental justice work. And I think that that's really what makes it hard for more traditional climate reporters to get into the beat, because you know, folks are used to talking to scientists, or they're used to talking to maybe, you know, government officials. But with EJ in particular, the emphasis is on community organizers, you know, who are on the front lines of advocating against XYZ industry or polluter. And I think, you know, giving attention to who are the major players here. You know, there are the folks on the ground, on the front lines doing the work, but there are also the people creating, the individuals and the companies creating these problems for these communities, right? Largely big oil. Emily Atkin, who runs the Heated newsletter, you know, she has done an incredible job just targeting these polluters and these big players that are behind the climate crisis, but also behind the disenfranchisement that many of these communities are facing. So I think getting a sense of, you know, EJ is so broad, right? There's so many stories to be told there. Figuring out what your focus might be, whether that's immigration or pollution or, you know, health more broadly. And then figuring out who are the big players there and targeting them, whether that's through, you know, interviewing or you know, public records requests. I think that's a really strong way to get into EJ. But speaking to folks on the ground, I think is a great first step that people often skip.
I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. We're at the end of the hour. This has been a terrific conversation. Thank you all for your candor, for your wisdom, for your energy. We've been joined today by Varshini Prakash. She is the executive director of the Sunrise Movement, and Yessenia Funes, who is the reporter who does some of the best reporting out there on environmental justice at Earther, which is the vertical at Gizmodo, and Kendra Pierre-Louis, who is with, I can't see who she's with right now, actually. She used to be with the New York Times. Follow her on her Twitter feed. She has a particular thing about mayonnaise. I don't get it, but the rest of it is really great. I'm Mark Herstgaard. I'll just remind you, our next Talking Shop is July 1st. We're going to talk about the climate connections to extreme weather. This particular Talking Shop, well, the recording will be up online, probably not till Monday. And we thank you very much for your attention, and we'll see you next time. Farewell.